Are you a new developer that wants to learn PHP, or you're just looking around to see which programming language suits you the best? Or are you used to PHP and just want a refresher? You have just clicked on the right video. We will be covering the most known procedural programming topics when you want to start learning PHP. I'm not going to cover the installation process of PHP on your local machine, since that could take up to 30 minutes. I want to directly dive into the coding part, so I'm kind of expecting you to have your HTTP server and code editor up and running. I always try to keep my coding projects in one place, so I've created a workspace directory on my desktop where I always store my coding projects. I'm currently using PHPStorm, where I can create a new project inside my workspace directory named PHP. At the moment, PHPStorm have opened my PHP directory right inside of PHPStorm, where I'm going to create a new file, and it can't be an index.html file. PHP code can be added right here. When you want to write PHP code, you need to create a file that has a .php extension. So right here, we're going to create a new file named index.php. Even though our file has the extension of .php to it, we still need to tell the file that we want to write PHP code, which can be done by creating an opening and optionally closing PHP tag. The opening tag is the less than sign, question mark, PHP, and whenever you want to close it, you need to add a question mark greater than sign. Now the closing PHP tag is only necessary when you're going to work with HTML and PHP. For this tutorial, we're going to stick with PHP code, so we could simply remove the closing tag. Now I've just rescheduled my screen. I have PHPStorm on the left and the browser to the right. Before we start learning any PHP code, let's take a moment and have a look at commenting. And unlike any other code you're going to write, comments will not run like the rest of your code. Comments are mainly used to organize and explain certain parts of your code that might not be clear to another developer. The usual rule of thumb I follow is that I only add comments when I'm building a complex functionality that other developers that open my application don't understand. Now by adding a comment, I'm just giving them a little bit more explanation. In the future, you will see that you sometimes will comment out certain parts of your code functionality, because it allows you to deactivate sections of your application, which helps you with the debugging process of your app. PHP has a total of 3 built-in ways of commenting. The first method is the traditional method, which allows you to comment out a single line of code, which can be added with a double /. Right here, you could add a comment of, let's say, first comment line. You could also see that the color changes compared to the PHP opening tag and is lighter, which means that it's a comment. Now once we run our application inside the browser, you will see that the comment has not been printed out because you can only see it inside your actual code. Even if we inspect the page and open our body tag, you'll see that nothing has been added right here. Now the second method is used whenever you want to comment out multiple lines, and usually it's just a block of code. The syntax for that starts with a /*, asterisk, PHPStorm auto-filled it for me at an asterisk with a /. And in between the opening and closing comment tag, you could add whatever you want which will be commented out. So let's say commented multiple lines. Now the last method is actually not used very often because it is the shell method, where you could simply add a hashtag which offers you a single comment line. So let's say the shell comment. Now the next topic that we're going to cover are variables. So let's get rid of all the comments that we have right here. And you can see a variable as a temporary data that will be stored in memory. Unlike other programming languages, PHP does not require you to declare a data type. And that's because PHP is a weakly typed programming language, meaning that you can use variables even without having them declared before. Whenever you want to define a new variable in PHP, you have to start off with a $sign, followed with a unique name for your variable. Keep in mind that there are certain conditions that have to be met before declaring them. You can use letters, numbers, and underscores when naming variables, but the order does matter. You can't use a number as a first character, so you basically can't say number 1, name, but you can say 1, name, which are basically letters that you could use right here. You could even say 1 underscore name, and you can even start with an underscore by saying underscore name. For now, we're just going to stick with a $sign name variable. In most cases, you define a variable and set it equal to a value. And we're going to look at data types in a bit, but for now, let's set it equal to a set of double quotes with a value of code with Dari. Keep in mind that whenever you want to define variables, you have to end the line with a semicolon. I have told my local machine that it should make a temporary storage for our name variable, which contains a value of code with Dari. There are also different styles of declaring variables. The most common style is using camel case, meaning that the first word is lowercase and the remaining of the words are capitalized. An example might be my first name, where the letter N and the letter F are both capitalized. So we could set that equal to, let's say, Dari. There's a second style, which is called snake case, where all characters are lowercase, but words are separated with an underscore. Another example might be $, my underscore first underscore name is equal to Dari. The last method is using Pascal case, but honestly, this isn't common when defining variables. With Pascal case, every word is capitalized, even the first one. An example might be $, my first name is equal to Dari, where you will see that even the letter M is capitalized. Now keep in mind that it doesn't matter which method you use. The most important thing that matters is your own consistency. There isn't a format that's better or has a clear advantage. If you prefer to use camel case, go for it, but use it for all your variables. Now Pascal case honestly is mostly used when defining classes. That's one I truly would recommend skipping. Now for the end user, all output inside the browser is the same, whether you're working with decimal numbers, whole numbers, or pieces of text. But as a programmer, you work with something which is called data types. Variables that you define in PHP can hold any type of data, but these aren't all stored in the same exact way. Now PHP supports a total of 8 data types. We have technically worked with the first one, which is the value that we have on our screen right now, wrapped inside a set of double quotes. And this is called a string. And a string is basically a couple or even tons of characters. At the moment, we have a couple strings defined, so let's remove the bottom 3. And let's also define another one, because PHP allows you to define a string using a set of single quotes as well. So let's say we have a variable called sentence, and we're going to set it equal to single quotes, and let's add a value of what is up YouTube. Now the issue that we might run into right here is the fact that using special symbols can give us a headache. Not everyone writes what is. You could even use a single quote right here. It's throwing an error, because we pretty much wrap the word what in a single quote, while the rest of the sentence isn't part of the value of our variable sentence anymore. In situations like these, I prefer to use double quotes. So let's replace our single quotes with double quotes right here, and you will see that the error is gone. Now let me add a comment saying that this is a string. The second data type is an integer, and an integer is simply a whole number. In programming terms, it can be as long as 32 bits. And I'll put the minimum and maximum number of 32 bits on the screen right now because it's quite a long number to pronounce. When defining integers, there's no need to wrap the value inside a set of single quotes or double quotes, because PHP does understand that it's a number. Keep in mind that you're completely free to add single or double quotes, but it will not read it as an integer anymore, but as a string. And the downside of that takes a little bit too long to cover right now. So let's create a new variable right here, and let's name it age, and let's set it equal to the number 27. PHP numbers can be positive or negative. So we could even define a new variable right below it, let's say age minus, which is equal to minus 27. Let me add a comment right here of an integer. Now another note is that an integer is not the same as a decimal number in coding. In PHP, you are dealing with floating point numbers. You pretty much define them in the same exact way, but you just need to add a dot to define the decimal number. So let's define a new variable called price, and let's set it equal to 10.50. And right here, we're dealing with a float. Once you start getting comfortable in coding, you will find tons of booleans, which has two predefined values. It could either be true or it could be false. So let's say that we want to define a new variable called isTrue, and the value is the keyword true. Now we could even define a second variable called isFalse, where the value is equal to false. Booleans are mostly used to store information that allows one of the two states. A very common data type and also a pretty complex one is arrays. And an array can simply be seen as a big box that can have items inside of it. There are two methods of defining arrays. The first method is defining a variable, but keep in mind that whenever you want to work with arrays, you mostly will store multiple values. So the name of your variable will in most cases be plural. So let's name it brands. And the first method is setting it equal to the keyword array. And we need to add an opening parenthesis and a closing parenthesis, which we'll call the array function. Right inside of the parentheses, we could define multiple values, or even brands, separated by a comma. So let's say the first value, in single quotes, will be Apple. The second option is Microsoft. The third option is UOI. Now keep in mind, you're not limited to strings, you could even add integers right here. Now behind the scenes, PHP will add unique keys to each value inside the array, starting with 0. In our example, Apple has a unique identifier of 0, Microsoft is 1, UOI is 2, while the number 10 is number 3. I know that I haven't covered outputting variables and so on, but let's quickly add a var dump right below of it, where we need to add the brands inside of it, and there's no need to follow up, I'll just want to show the output in the browser. Let's refresh it, and right here you will see that we have defined an array. It has an index of 0, so the starting point. The value is a string of 5 characters, and the value is Apple. Alright, let's navigate back, because we could also define associative arrays. Right below our brands array, let's define clubs, which is equal to an opening and closing bracket, which defines the second method on how you could define arrays. Usually, I prefer to go inside my parentheses and hit enter. This improves the readability of your associative array. And an associative array is actually nothing more than a regular array that we have defined before, but we will define the key names ourselves, rather than allowing PHP to define them. So basically, the 0, the number 1 that we have, the number 2 that we have, and the number 3. First, we're going to define the name of our key. So let's say single quotes BAR. Then outside of our single quote, we need to define the value, which needs to be done by adding a pointer, by adding the is sign, followed with the greater than sign, where we could then say in another set of single quotes, the value is Barcelona. Then we're going to add another key value pair. So right after our single quote, we need to add a comma. And on the line below, we could say, well, the second key is RM, while the value is Real Madrid. Now let's quickly replace the brands variable that we have inside our var dump to clubs. Let's refresh the browser. You'll see that we don't have a key of 0 and 1 anymore because they have been replaced with bar and RM. Now let me add a comment right here because this is an array. Now another data type that PHP offers is called null, which you will write in all caps. And honestly, this simply can have one value. So let's say $isEmpty is equal to capital null. You will use this type to mark empty variables, nothing more than that. There are actually 2 other data types which are not really necessary when you want to begin with PHP. I will mention them because you should obviously know them, but I won't cover them. The first one is called objects and the second one are resources. Now I've already showed you the var dump method here at the bottom, which is a commonly used method when outputting any type of data to the browser. But there are a couple other methods that you should know. Now the var dump function that we're using right here is mostly used whenever you want to debug a certain part of your application, mostly because it shows information of a variable. Once we replace our clubs variable with name, you will see that it's telling us that it's a string. It has 14 characters and the value is code with Dari. We could even change it to an integer, so let's output our age, which wraps the value of 27, which is the integer, inside an int function. Now one more example, let's replace our age with price, which will tell us that the value of 10.5 is wrapped inside a float method. Now if you think that the var dump method adds a little bit too much information, you could simply replace it with the print_r method. The biggest difference in the output is that it just removes a lot of unnecessary or unwanted information, and it's not really visible right here. So let's output our brands array, where you will see that it's simply telling us that it has an array, it has keys, and it has values. Next to the var dump and the print_r method, I usually make use of the echo method. So let's replace our print r with echo. And the biggest difference is that the echo function does technically not behave like a function. Now let's not print out a variable right here, because I also want to show you that you could directly print any type of value. So let's say that my name is Dari as a string will be directly printed out to the browser. Once we refresh the browser, you'll see that my name is Dari has been printed out. Now the biggest difference right here is that a lot of additional data, like the var_dum method, has been removed. Now we could obviously output a variable as well, so let's say age minus, and you'll see that the value of -27 has been printed out. Now next to the echo option, we have the print option, which is pretty much the same as the echo option, but it is significantly slower. At the moment, we're just outputting simple strings and integers, so you won't see a huge difference in an echo or print, but it will once you work with complex applications. Now the last output option that I want to show you is the print function, which is basically calling the print keyword, opening and closing parentheses. Then right inside of the parentheses, you could pass in strings, variables, whatever you want. So let's say that our age needs to be printed out, which is equal to 27. Now let's clean up our PHP file and start over again. Let's pretty much remove everything. All right. Because I want to talk about indirect references in PHP. Let's say that we have a variable defined named user and the value is code with Dari. Now we could override our variable by redefining a user again and setting it equal to another name of John Doe. Now once we echo our user, you'll see that John Doe has been printed out and it has overridden the first variable of user. Now PHP allows us to add a second $sign to our second variable user. So let's do that right here. All right. Once we refresh it, you will see that code with Dari has been printed out, and that's because of the extra $sign, which will tell the PHP interpreter that you are referring to a value contained by the variable involved. Now that's all pretty annoying, right? Being able to override variables or being aware of the fact that you should add two $signs. Now PHP has another solution for that, which is known as constants. Whenever you define a PHP constant, you can change the assigned value of it. Think about defining a main user of your application. Why would you ever want to replace the name of it? You usually want to define it once and don't give the user the option to override the value. In case the value needs to be changed, you could simply replace the constant value. A general rule of thumb to remember is that constants are usually defined at the top of a PHP file. You could obviously define it in the middle or even at the bottom, but in 99% of the cases, this will be done at the top of a file. Now, whenever you want to define a constant, you first need to clean up your PHP file and define the define function. So we need to add parentheses and a semicolon. Now, whenever you want to define your constant values, you have to pass in two values. The first value will represent the constant name, where you later can call the constant by its name, which will then show a value to the end user. So we need to add a comma, while the second option is the value. Now this obviously doesn't work, since you need to work with single quotes or double quotes. Now the constant name is typically a string that consists letters and numbers. Constants are always defined in capital letters because it shows other users that a constant is being defined or used. And the same rules of defining variables will be used for the name. So let's say double quotes, app_user. And then for the value, it should either be a string, integer, float, and so on. So pretty much any data type except the objects or arrays. Let's say that the user inside our application has a name of code with Dari. Now the biggest difference right here is the fact that you don't need to add a $sign, even when you want to show the constant value to the user. Let's define a var_dump, and as a value we need to call the key of our constant, so let's say app_user. If we refresh the browser, you will see that a string has been printed out of 14 characters with a value of code with Dari. Another interesting fact is that a constant doesn't have a magical data type, but it will grab the value that has been assigned to our current constant, which will be a string right here. Like I've said before, you can't redefine a key of app_users inside your application again. Let's duplicate a line If we then navigate to the browser and refresh it, you'll see that we received a warning right here, which says that the constant app_user has already been defined. Now that we have talked about variables, data types, outputting variables and data, we're ready to move on to the next chapter where we will cover the different types of operators in PHP. So let me remove my constants and let's add a comment because we're going to focus on arithmetic operators. And you are most likely familiar with them since you use them in your daily life. Essentially, the usage of arithmetic operators is handy when you have numeric values that have to perform operations such as addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, calculating the modulus, and the exponentiation. So let's define two variables right here called num1 is equal to 10 and we have num2 which is equal to 4. And we're going to directly echo it out inside the browser just to make the process a little bit faster. So the first operator is addition. So we're simply going to add variable 1 to variable 2. If we output it, you'll see that the output is 14 because 10 plus 4 is 14. You could also subtract num1 from num2, which will output 6. Now we could multiply it by adding an asterisk, which will output 40, which is alright. We could divide it by adding a /, which will output 2.5. And we could calculate the exponentiation, which is basically the result of raising num1 to the power of num2 using the double asterisk operator. Once we output it, you'll see that we have 10,000. And finally, we got the option to calculate the remainder of num1 divided by num2 by adding a percentage sign, which will output 2. Now next to arithmetic operators, PHP has a couple assignment operators, which allows you to assign values to a variable. The biggest difference is that you write a variable name on the left-hand side of the expression. So let's define our variables again. Let's say num1 is 10 and num2 is 4. And we're going to place the value that we want to assign at the right-hand side of the expression. So let's say that we have num1 and we want to plus equal num2 to it. If we echo it out, so we need to echo out num1 because we have set the right hand side equal to the left hand side. But we set added and set it equal, which will output 14 for us. So this line that we have right here is equivalent to saying num1 is equal to num1 plus num2. Now the same thing could be performed to subtract. So we need to say minus is equal to, which will output 6. We could multiply again. So asterisk is equal to, which is 40. We could divide by saying / is equal to, is 2.5. And we could calculate the modulus, which is adding a percentage sign equal to, which will output 2 again. Now the next operator is actually pretty important. So let's remove everything that we have because we're going to focus on the comparison operator. In simple terms, the usage of comparison operators are simply used to compare two values or variables. This is, in my honest opinion, the most important operator when it comes to coding, because it helps you to find answers and make decisions based on that. Now you can't really do calculations with comparison operators. It has two return values, either true or false. If we think about a login system, we have a user which can add its username and password. A comparison operator will be used to check whether the entered credentials exist inside a database. If it does, it will return true, which allows the user to proceed. Now, if the credentials do not match, it will throw an error. So let's get right into it. Let's define our num1 again and our num2. And then on the line below, we're going to var_num. And we're going to check whether our num1 is equal to num2, which can be done by adding two equal signs and defining num2. Once we output it inside of the browser, you'll see that the return value is false, meaning that num1 is not equal to num2, which is obviously true because num1 is equal to 10 and num2 is equal to 4. Now we could even add 3 equal signs instead of 2, which returns true if num1 and num2 are equal, but the data type should be equal as well. So let's change it up a little bit. If we set num2 equal to 10, you'll see that it returns true, but if we wrap our num2 value inside a set of double quotes, so we're making it a string right now, refresh the browser, you will see that the output is false, even though both values are 10. And this is happening because the data type of num2 is not an integer anymore, because we wrapped it inside a set of double quotes, which makes it a string. We could also check whether the value is not equal to, which is exactly the opposite of what we have been doing. So this will basically return true if both values are not equal. So first we need to set the value of num2 equal to 4. And instead of adding 3 equal signs, we're going to add an exclamation mark and an equal sign. Once we refresh the browser, you will see that true has been printed out. Now there is even a second syntax for this, which is replacing the operator with a less than and greater than sign. If we refresh it, you'll see that the output is still true. We could also check whether the operations are not equal and the data types are not the same, which is pretty much the same syntax as the 3 equal signs, but we need to start off with an exclamation mark and add 2 equal signs. If we refresh it, you'll see that the output is true, because A, the data types are not equal, and B, the values are not equal as well. Now we could check whether the value on the left-hand side of the operator is greater than the right-hand side. So let's say that we want to check if num2 is greater than num1, where we could simply add the greater than sign. Once we output it, you will see that the output is true because num1 is 10, while num2 is equal to 4, meaning that num1 is greater than num2. You could even add an equal sign right after the greater than sign right here. So we're going to say it's greater than or equal to. Now at the moment, the output will still be true. But if we replace number 4 with 10, well, at the moment it's not greater, but it is equal to. So therefore the output is true. Now the operator could be turned around as well. So we could say it's less than. Now at the moment it will return false because it's equal to. But we could say less than or equal to. Refresh it, which will change the output to true because it is equal, but not less than. Now the next operator we're going to cover are logical operators. So let me clean it up. All right. Now the logical operator performs a logical operation on true and false. In most cases, these are performed with conditional statements. We will be performing it in a bit, but let's stick to the far dump right now. Let's define 2 new variables, where the first one is called username, which is equal to code with Dari, while we also have a password, which is equal to test1234. When creating a login system, you do want to check whether the username and password that have been entered are equal to a specific value inside the database. Now we obviously don't have a database connection set up, so let's see if the variables that we have created right here are equal to a static value. So we're going to add a var_dump, and I'm going inside of it and hit enter just so the readability is a little bit better right here. So whenever a user tries to log in, we're first going to check if the username is equal to the string of code with Dari. But let's say that for the logical operator, we want to check 2 values. We also want to say $&, the password is equal to test1234. Now once we output it, you'll see that the return value is true. And with the $& operator that we have added right here, we set to PHP, well, whatever happened on the left and on the right need both to return true in order for this condition to pass. Now let's add a small typo right here. So let's say code with Dari 2. If we output it, you'll see that the return value is false, even though the password is true. And this is happening because not both operands have passed the test. In most cases, you will use this inside an if statement. So let me show you quickly what I mean. I'm going to create an if statement right here. I'm going to copy the var dump value and paste it as the condition. And we're going to cover if statements in the next chapter, but just follow along for now. What we're simply going to say right here is that if the username and password are equal to the values that we entered, echo out passed, else we're going to echo out failed. So whenever both conditions return true, passed will be printed out, otherwise false. So let me comment out my var dump, refresh it, and right here you will see that passed has been printed out. Alternatively, you could even replace the $& that we have with the keyword AND, which will check exactly the same because the output is passed as well. Now sometimes we want to check whether at least one of the operands are true. With the AND operator, we're saying that both operands needs to be true. For that, we could replace the AND keyword with two pipes. If we refresh it, you'll see that passed has been printed out. So let's add a typo inside our name, so code with Dari2, and you'll see that it still prints out passed because even though the username is wrong, the password operand has passed, and we only need one of those two to pass. And just like the AND keyword, you could even replace the two pipes with the keyword OR. So if we refresh it, you'll see that pass has still been printed out. You could even replace the keyword OR with XOR, which will be true once the left or the right operand are true, but not both of them. The left operand is false, so if we refresh it, you'll see that it has passed the test. But if we set our username to code with Dari again, so both operands are true, refresh it, you'll see that the output is false. Finally, you could even add an exclamation mark right in front of your operand. So let's clean this up a little bit. Let's remove our XOR and password. And let's even remove the value right here. We could say that, well, if the username has not been set, and that's what the question mark is doing. Once we remove it, we're basically saying, well, if the variable password is set, print out passed. But if the variable is not been set, print out failed. Alright, let's clean up the page and we're gonna focus on conditional statements. Whether you are a beginner or advanced developer, PHP developer, Java developer, or even a Python developer, conditional statements will be everywhere. I know that I've already used an if statement once, but let's create a new one right here. The main goal of conditional statements is to determine if a comparison is true or false. The comparison needs to happen right inside of the parentheses. If the statement inside the parentheses is true, then the code right inside of the curly braces will be executed. Now this only checks one flow, whether the condition has been passed. Therefore, you could even add an else statement right after the closing curly brace, which will be executed once the comparison is false. So let's add a condition first. Let's say that we're going to check whether our variable username is equal to code with Dari. Now let's define our username right above it by saying username is equal to code with Dari. Whoops, typo right here. Alright, now once the condition has passed, which it will do right now, we're going to output our username inside a echo, but the string attached to it. Well, there are two options. We could concatenate by saying username dot space, and we could add a string to it of exists. If we navigate to the browser and refresh it, you'll see that the output is code with Dari exists. Now there is another syntax to do this as well, which I actually prefer, and that's adding our variable inside the string. So let's remove what we have right here. Let's add a set of double quotes and a semicolon. And then we're gonna add curly braces because our variable needs to be wrapped inside of it. So let's say that our username space exists. Once we output it, you'll see that code with Dari exists has been printed out as well. Now the issue that we have right here is that if we change the value of code with Dari right here to code with Dari2, refresh it, you'll see that the output is empty. And this is happening because we're not performing anything inside of the else statement, which will be called if the condition from the if statement right here is false. So let's add an echo right here of username does not exist. Now once we refresh it right now, you'll see that the else statement has been triggered and username does not exist has been printed out. The issue that we have right here is that we're simply checking one condition, right? We're just checking whether our username is equal to a string. Now we could create multiple if statements right below of it. So let's create another one right here where we're going to check the string length of the username by saying strlen, which is a function, so we need to add parentheses. We're going to check the length of our username, and it needs to be less than 15. So if it's less than 15 characters, we're going to echo out username is too short. Now what we have right here isn't best practice. We have two if statements, but imagine if we have 10 of them. What we could do right here is pushing our else statement a little bit to the bottom, go right after our closing curly brace, and add the else if statement right here. Keep in mind that the else if statement requires a condition. So let's say that we want to check the condition that we defined inside our if statement. And we want to also add the echo. Now, once we execute our code, it will first check whether the username is equal to code with Dari2. If it isn't, it will just go to the else if statement. It will check if the length is less than 15. If it is, it will echo out username is too short. But even if the else if statement is false, it will call, the else statement right here. Once we refresh it, you'll see that the username is short because the username is not equal to code with Dari2. So it pretty much skipped the first if statement, went over to the second, said, well, you are true, so I don't need to go to the else statement. Quick note, you could add as many else if statements as you want. We could even add another one right here, where we're simply going to check whether the string length of the username is less than 25. Then we're going to echo out username is too short. Now, once you have too many if and else if statements, programmers usually tend to use a switch statement. And a switch statement compares an expression against all of the possible entries that have been defined. So let's go right above our if-else statement. Now let's define a switch keyword, parentheses, curly braces. The switch statement allows you to add multiple cases which will be checked based on the condition. So let's say that our condition is just a check on the username. Then inside our switch, we need to start off by defining cases by using the keyword case, which is pretty much equal to a new if statement. Now let's say that we're going to check whether the string length, so strlen, parentheses, is less than 10, colon, but we need to pass in the string length of the word username. Now let's go at the end of the line, hit enter. We have to perform whatever needs to happen if the condition is true. So let's say echo username has less than 10 characters. If the condition has been met, we need to break it so other cases won't be checked, which can be done by going on the line below and adding the keyword break, semicolon. Now we could even duplicate our entire case right here, where we could check if the username is less than 20 characters. And we could even add another one, well actually as many as you want, where we're going to check if the case is less than 30 characters. So the first case right here is equal to the first if statement that we have. Then it has an else if, then it has another else if. Now keep in mind that you can even add the else statement inside the switch statement. Well, not exactly with the keyword else, but we're going right below our break. And we're going to define a default colon, which will basically be the default value if the cases have not matched the requirements. So let's say that we want to echo out, you are using too many characters. Now let's remove our if statement at the top. Refresh the browser. You'll see that username has less than 20 characters has been printed out. And the second case inside our switch statement has been triggered. Now let's make sure that we trigger the default by saying code with Dari, and let's copy paste it a couple times. Refresh it, and you'll see that it says that you are using too many characters because the default value has been triggered because every other case has not been matched. Now let's clean it up again because we're gonna have one code with our user and we don't need our switch. Now using the if, else, and switch statement is pretty nice, but sometimes might be too much code for simple conditions at times. PHP has a shortcut for it, which is called the ternary operator. And the ternary operator is a condition operator which decreases the length of code while performing comparisons and conditions. Keep in mind that you could overuse the ternary operator as well, because it can be overkill inside your code. Now let's say that we want to check whether the username has been set. If it is true, we're going to print out the username. Otherwise, we're going to print out a message saying that the username has not been set. Let me quickly define the if-else statement for it, and you don't need to follow along on this one. So we have an if. We're going to check if the username has been set. If it has, we're going to echo out the username is username. Else, we're going to echo out username has not been set. Let's refactor this into a ternary operator. Right below of it, we're going to start off with an echo. We're going to echo out the condition of variable username, which will check whether the username has been set, so it will either return true or false. Then we're going to add a space, question mark, another space, followed with a string inside of the if statement. We're basically going to output what will happen once the username has been set. So let's say username is variable username. Now you'll see that we have an error because we need to add something which will happen if the condition is false. Right now we're only checking whether the condition is true. So we need to add a space colon, space, username has not been set. And I'll need to remove my typo right here. Everything after the colon is pretty much equal to the else statement. Once we remove our if statement inside our code, refresh our browser, you'll see that username is code which already has been printed out, which basically happens because the username variable has been set, so the left-hand side of the operand has been triggered. The next few chapters of this course are dedicated to loops, and loops are used to execute the same code multiple times. An example of a loop might be to increase number 1 to 10. You can say that it needs to loop 10 times, and every loop iteration, it needs to increase the integer value with 1. Up until this point, we haven't used the arrays we defined inside an echo or print. So let's test it out. Let's delete what we have on our screen, and let's actually redefine our branch array, and let's set it equal to an array where we have the first value of Apple, we have Microsoft, and we have Huawei. Now, if we then echo our branch variable, refresh the browser, you will see that we have received an error right here because we're trying to convert our array into a string. This basically means that you can't just output an array like we're doing right now, since you can only output single values, and an array has multiple values inside of it. Now, there are multiple types of loops, and I want to start off using the Foreach loop, which is a common used method when working with arrays. What we need to do is removing our echo. We need to define the keyword for each, add parentheses and curly braces. Now the for each statement accepts a condition which needs to be an array it has to loop over. So let's say that we want to loop over our branch array. Now we're not done yet, since the branch array consists of all array items. We need to loop over all of our branches, but we want to print our brand individually. So we need to add a space right here, add a keyword as, and we need to define a new variable named brand. Keep in mind that unlike any other loop, it is not required to create code that checks for the end of an array. Usually, if you don't end your array on time, you will run into an infinite loop which won't stop spinning the loop. Now inside the array, we could simply say that we want to echo out every single brand during every iteration. Now let's go over it one more time. We defined a for each loop, and we want to loop over all the brands that we have up here. Now every single brand will be assigned to brand. Microsoft will be assigned to a brand, and Huawei will be assigned to a brand. So every iteration, so whenever it iterates over the first value, it will echo that specific brand. Once we refresh it inside the browser, you'll see that Apple, Microsoft, and Huawei as a string value have been printed out. We can even double check that by replacing our echo with a var_dump. Refresh it, you'll see that we have 3 string values of Apple, Microsoft, and Huawei. The second type of loop that PHP has to offer are while loops. And most of the programmers find a while loop the simplest loop to use. Now let's remove our for each loop right here. And let's define the while loop by writing down the keyword while, parentheses, curly braces. The condition of the while loop is called an expression. And before it iterates, the program will check whether the expression that is being checked can be executed. If it can, it will continue and perform whatever we have defined inside the curly braces. If it can't, the loop will end and it will continue with anything that happens after. Now let's define a new variable at the top, variable I, and let's set it equal to 1. Then for our expression inside a while loop, we could use our variable I and say that it should do something as long as the value is less than 10. So for every iteration, we are going to say echo out variable I. Keep in mind that variable I is not increasing its value every iteration right now. If we run it right now, we will run into an infinite loop because the value 1 will be printed out every single time. Now what we could do is go to the left hand side of the semicolon and add 2 plus signs, which is an increment operator, which will plus 1 every iteration to variable I. You will see that the number 1 up until number 9 are printed out. I've just mentioned that the while loop checks if the expression that is being checked can be performed. Sometimes you don't want that. You want to execute it at least once and check the expression. So there is another type of loop available which will do that for you, which is called the do while loop, where we will basically do something and we will check afterwards if the condition has been met. So let's remove our while loop and let's define the do while loop by first saying do, curly braces. So whatever we define inside our do statement will be executed at least once, and then it will check the condition inside the while statement, semicolon, where we're going to check whether our variable I is less than 10. But it needs to do something first, which needs to be performed inside the do statement. So let's echo out variable I plus plus. Now once we refresh the browser, you'll see the same exact output, number 1 up until 9. And you do even have the option to break the statement right below the echo, which makes it a little bit more clearer for you that the do statement will be performed at least once. So once we refresh it, you'll see that 1 has been printed out because the do statement has been executed at least once. After that, the break statement will be called, where it will simply break the iteration. The last loop that we will cover is the for loop. And the for loop is pretty useful when you know exactly how many times you want to loop. So let's remove our do while loop, and we can even remove our variable I. Let's define it by saying for, parentheses, curly braces, and the for loop has 3 values that you need to add inside the parentheses, also called parameters, which you then need to separate with semicolons. The first parameter is the counter value. And this will basically be the starting point of when the iteration starts. It has a second parameter, which is the test counter. And right here, it will simply evaluate every iteration. If it is true, the loop will continue. If it evaluates false, the loop will end. And finally, we have the increment counter, which will increase the loop counter value every single iteration. Now let's replace the words that we have added right here with actual values. Let's remove the counter value right here. And let's set variable I equal to 1. And for our test counter, we're going to say that we need to loop as long as variable I is less than or equal to 10. And we're going to increase our variable I with 1 every single iteration. So let's say $i plus plus. Finally, we're going to echo out our variable I every single iteration. Once we navigate to the browser and refresh it, you will see that number 1 up until 10 are printed out. Now let's have a look at a bit more complex topic for beginners, which are functions. PHP supports 2 types of functions. We have built-in functions, which are essentially functions that PHP has created for us and that we can use. And we have actually used one, where we decided to calculate the number of characters of a string. Let's define it again. Let's remove what we have on the screen, and we're going to echo out the strlen. And whenever you want to work with functions, you need to add a opening and closing parenthesis followed with a semicolon. Inside the parentheses, you will be adding arguments, and the amount and type of arguments depends on the function you're going to use. Whenever you want to use a specific function, you usually refer to the official documentation of PHP. For now, we could simply pass in a string right here of code with Dari. And right here, we have made of a PHP supported built-in function which returned a value of 14 characters for us. In addition to built-in functions, PHP allows you to define user-defined functions, which you, the developer, can create and use within your application. Whenever you want to define a user function, you need to start off with the function keyword, all in lowercase. Then you need to add a space where you need to define a custom function name, which is completely up to you, but it should be unique. Keep in mind that the name of a function follows the same principles of variables, but you need to exclude the $sign. So we could either say display underscore name, or we could say display, so camel case, uppercase N of name. Now, like we have done with the string length method, we have the option to pass in variables or values. So when defining your function, you need to add parentheses here as well. Now, the display function should perform some kind of logic that we will output once it makes use of it. All that specific logic goes in between an opening and closing curly brace. Now, whenever we want to display, let's say, a username, we could either define a variable outside of our scope, so outside of our function, let's say name is equal to code with Dari, and we could even add an echo, right, of our variable name. Let's copy what we have, paste it inside of the function, which will execute whatever we have, but we cannot use our variable name outside of the function. Now we have to make sure that we call our function as well outside of the function, so we want to make use of it. So let's go right below it, and let's write down the function name. So let's say display name, add parentheses, and close it off with a semicolon. So whenever you're going to define your function, you need to add curly braces. Whenever you want to call your function, you need to close it off with a semicolon. Now keep in mind that it is best practice to add our functions either at the top or the bottom of your code. It doesn't matter where, as long as you're consistent. Usually, you want to pass in some kind of data to your function, so something can happen with it. As you can see right now, we have made a call to our function named displayName, and it has echoed out the name variable. Now, like I've just said, the annoying part right here is that we can't use our variable name anymore outside of our function. If we try to echo it out, you'll see that we're getting a warning because we're having an undefined variable named $name. So usually, you want to define your variables outside of your function, pass it into your function so something can happen with it. So let's move our variable name outside of our function. You'll see that the echo outside of our function has no warning, but the echo inside of our function does. Essentially, we want to say that whenever we want to make use of our display name, we need to make sure that we have a named variable passed through, so we can use that inside our function, which can be done by going inside the parentheses of your function. And it's not required to have the same name right here as your variable because it makes the code readability a lot better. Now the name that we're passing in will be echoed out, but at the moment we're not passing it in because right here we're making a call to our function, but we need to say, well, whenever I'm going to use my function, I'm going to pass in the name, which will be grabbed inside of the function, which we will then echo out. Once we refresh it, you'll see that our name has been printed out twice. So whenever you're going to call your function, you're working with parameters right here. And whenever you're defining your function, you're working with arguments. So right here, our variable name is an argument. And right outside of our function scope, we're working with parameters. Now you could even remove your variable up here. So let's do that. We're going to keep our argument name. And instead of echoing out our name, let's remove that as well. We're going to make a call to our function. But instead of defining the name that we don't have, we could simply pass in a string right here of code with Dari. Once we refresh it, you'll see that it has been printed out as well. Keep in mind that you could also pass in multiple arguments, so pretty much as many as you want. But you'll have to separate them with a comma. So let's say that our first argument is name, comma, age, which will be the second one. Then inside our function call, we could add another comma and say that the age is 27. Once we refresh it, well, we need to echo it out. Excuse me, let's say that we want to echo out a string where our curly brace $name is the age years old, where you will see that code Udemy is 27 years old has been printed out. Ever since PHP 8 got released, they added a union of different data types. Now at the moment, we're sending back a string of code Udemy and an integer of 27. When inside the argument, right here, we could tell our function what type of data it should receive, which needs to happen right in front of the argument. And let's define the data type right here for our name, which will be a string. And for our age, let's go right in front of it and let's write down int. Now once we refresh it in the browser, you will see that we have the same exact output. And that's because we're passing in a string for our name and an integer for our age right here. Keep in mind that the order matters. You can't pass in the integer first and accept the function to know that it's an age, even though the data type is an integer. Now let's change our integer to a string for now, so let's wrap it inside double quotes, refresh it, where you will see that we are still able to output our echo. And this is happening because we haven't told our PHP file that the parameters passed in should be strictly checked. To do that, we need to go to our first line right here with our opening PHP tag and make a call to the declare function, so parentheses, semicolon, where we need to pass in a value right here of strict underscore times, which needs to be set equal to 1, which is pretty much equal to true. You could already tell that we're getting an error message for our age right here, but once we refresh the browser, you'll see that we have received an error message because we have an uncaught type error, since the second argument that we have right here must be a type of int, but a string has been given. Once we change our age back to an integer, refresh it, you will see that the error is gone. Now I can see another issue coming up right here. The age right here is a full number, obviously. But let's say that we don't want to pass in an age, but a user balance. The value right here could either be a float or an integer, right? It could be a full number or a decimal number. So let's start off by replacing our echo first with $name, has a balance of, and let's pass in our balance right here. Let's replace the balance value when we make a call to our function to 500.50. Refresh it. You'll see that we have the same exact error because it's expecting an integer, but we have given a float. Now there is a solution for that, so let's go right after the keyword int inside our argument, where we could add a space, pipe, another space, float, where we are basically telling our function that the balance could either be an integer or a float. Once we refresh the page, you will see that the error is gone. All variables or values that you pass in as a parameter inside a function are unique. The variables that you define outside of a function can't be used inside a function. So let's define a new variable, and let's say that we have a variable sentence, which is equal to this can't be used inside a function. Let's remove the arguments because we don't need it anymore. And let's replace our echo with our $sentence variable. Now we need to clean up our function call as well, so let's remove everything that we have inside of it. And you'll see an error message right here. And once I refresh it, you'll see that we have an undefined variable of $sentence in line 5. Now this is happening because each function right here has a unique collection of variables. And at the moment, the sentence variables is outside of the function scope, meaning that we can't use it inside of it, unless we pass it inside the function parameter right here and right here. Now let's define a new variable inside our function named sentence, and let's set it equal to this will be used inside a function. Now let's print out our variable inside an echo right here as well. Refresh the page. And right here, you will see that both sentences have been printed out. So this is the first one and this is the second one. Because we first made a call to our sentence variable, which will refer to the first sentence that we have defined right above our function. But we have also called our function itself, which has its own variable called sentence, which we have echoed out. So keep in mind that whatever you define outside of your function can't magically be used inside your function. Now so far, we have just echoed something out on the screen. But in a lot of cases when working with functions, you will see the return statement getting used. What this does is simply returning a value by a value. It will create a copy of the appropriate value and sends it back to the user. So let's redefine what we have right here. Let's remove our variable inside our function. We're getting an error right here, so let's pass in a sentence right here inside our function argument and as a parameter as well. And instead of saying echo, we're going to return it directly. Let's remove the echo that we have right below our function. And if we refresh it, you'll see that we don't have any output. Right now, our function display name will return back the sentence, but we aren't really doing anything with it right here. We're simply making a call. So what we could do is say, well, echo it out outside of this function. Once we do that, you'll see that the string has been printed out. The biggest difference between using an echo or a return statement inside a function is that a return statement immediately ends execution of the current function. So it always needs to be placed at the bottom of a function. Anything that you define after it won't be executed. Now this was it for this tutorial where we covered the basic PHP beginners topics. I hope that I got you into PHP and you will continue on. I have tons of other PHP tutorials related to procedural programming, object-oriented programming, and tons of PHP frameworks as well. If you did enjoy the tutorial, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you're new to this channel and want to see more, feel free to subscribe to the channel and follow me on Instagram and Twitter.